Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tidewater Beekeepers Association monthly membership meeting for the month of October. Before I introduce our speakers, we have two separate speakers. I just wanted to put out that the Tidewater Beekeepers Association doesn't condone or promote or any of those issues with cannabis or marijuana or anything like that. But because it is becoming legal more and more, and the state of Virginia is starting that process also, I will remind you that it is still illegal from the federal standpoint. And our first speaker is Heather Grab, is a senior lecturer at Cornell University, delivers best practices for cultivation and processing of cannabis and hemp to professionals in Cornell's hemp science program. In a research role at Virginia Tech, she used remote sensing, large-scale community data sets, and advanced analytical methods to create data-driven solutions for challenges at the interface of natural resource conservation and agriculture. You take it from there, Heather.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here to talk with you guys. I think it's fantastic that as a group of beekeepers, you are thinking about this topic. I think it is very forward thinking and very important for beekeepers in particular to be talking about. I mostly end up these days giving talks to folks who are growing hemp. I will also say as a disclaimer that as somebody who is associated with federally funded research institutions and universities, I also am not able to work with high THC marijuana or cannabis plants. So you'll see hemp featured as a word throughout the talk today. But what we do know about the basic biology of the plant is that it's really just a few enzymes. So I tried to add in a little bit of the technical side to give you some background on cannabinoid production in cannabis plants broadly, in case you're not familiar with that science. I'm definitely happy to answer any questions on that. But I will also say that my true background is really in entomology. That was my first love and passion. And I developed my skills and knowledge in that area while conducting my PhD at Cornell University in entomology, working with the group of scientists that you'll see here who are broadly focused on sustainable agricultural solutions. And most of my research was really focused on creating applied pollinator management solutions for small fruit growers and for organic vegetable producers within New York State. So I spent a lot of time over the past decade thinking about the critical role that pollinators play as ecosystem service providers. I'm sure this is not a new fact for any of you here, but mostly what I've been thinking about is globally the increase in the production of pollinator-dependent crops, which has not necessarily kept pace with the increase in the availability of managed honeybee stocks through time. And even more importantly, for some crops, the decline of many wild pollinator species around farms. So this is what a typical farm that I worked on in New York State might look like. A lot of orchard growing in the region. One of my big projects was to look at wildflower plantings on farms as a method for supporting bee populations that provide services to these farmers. And we can think about a number of threats that might occur. I'm sure you as a group are very much familiar with these, but they include things like pesticides, loss of floral resources for the wild pollinators, loss of nesting habitat around the farm. And these are really issues that operate at the landscape scale. So they require these landscape level solutions in order to address them. So zooming in way in, I want to give you guys a primer a little bit on cannabis so you understand where cannabinoids come from on the plant and what the diversity of different cannabinoid compounds are that are out there, so you can understand how these two pieces might come together, so that you get the picture for how I think, at least, cannabis and really more broadly the industrial hemp side of the cannabis market might provide some important resources for wild bees. So hemp plants and cannabis, hemp is the term that we use for cannabis that is legally compliant at the federal level, so less than a certain amount of THC in that plant, is produced within these structures on the plant called trichomes. There's many different kinds of plant trichomes out there. If you look at your tomato plants, you'll see lots and lots of hair trichomes, but cannabis produces a kind of trichome called a glandular trichome. And in those glandular trichomes, in the head portion, we accumulate compounds like cannabinoids as well as terpenes. So those are the aroma compounds that we're familiar with from many other kinds of plants. So if you think linalool as a compound that's commonly associated with lavender, that's certainly one. Humulene is another terpene frequently found in hops. It gives your IPAs their nice aromas and flavors. But in addition to terpenes, we're also accumulating cannabinoids in those trichomes. So that's an image of what those trichomes look like up close. They are mostly being formed on the female tissues of hemp plants and their reproductive structures on the calyx here. So that's the female inflorescence for hemp. And we know from looking at the distribution across different plant parts, we're definitely seeing these primarily in inflorescences. They can also show up in leaf tissue, and in very small amounts, cannabinoids do show up in the stems and even the roots of hemp plants, although we only find the other aromatic compounds like terpenes in the inflorescences and in the leaves. So we spend a lot of time thinking about cannabinoids because they are one of the compounds that define this, unique component of the plant. But I think there's a lot of potential for terpenes as well, because we know terpenes are essential for mediating interactions between plants, microbes, and insects. And so they may be playing a role with the bees that are visiting them as well. I pulled this slide directly from one of the lecture series that I teach here at the university. Apologies if you hear my dogs playing in the background. But essentially, you'll hear a bunch of different acronyms for different kinds of cannabinoids. You might have heard of CBGA. That is the parent molecule. There's also, of course, THCA. And then more recently, a lot of interest in CBDA. There's also compounds that are present much more infrequently, like CBCA. All of those three molecules are converted by enzymes, different synthases, from that parent compound CBGA in the plant. And they're in the plant all present primarily in the acidic form. So those acidic forms are non-psychoactive. So if you want a psychoactive effect, you have to undergo a process that's mediated by heat, and in some cases also a little bit of UV action, in order to undergo this process called decarboxylation. So essentially, we're just moving a carbon dioxide molecule off of that precursor acidic form of the cannabinoid, and that is the form of the compound that is psychoactive. There are a huge array of other secondary reactions that can happen with those cannabinoids to give us this broad diversity of different cannabinoids. But I think it's just important to note that mostly what's being produced by the plant itself is the acidic form of those compounds that are non-psychoactive. So now getting back into the interaction between bees and hemp. So what we know from hemp is that there's two separate sexes in hemp plants. And for most cases, there are separate plants that have male flowers and female flowers. In a few grain cultivars, we do see monoecious as a trait. That means on a plant, there are both male and female flowers. And remember, again, I told you that it's mostly those female flowers that are producing all of those cannabinoid compounds. That's not to say that male plants don't produce them, but definitely in much, much lower abundance. So you can see in the image here that I'm showing, that's an example of what a male flower looks like on a cannabis plant. They're actually, I think, quite a subtly beautiful flower, but their whole mission, like everything they're geared towards, is producing high volumes of pollen. In cannabis, pollination occurs primarily mediated through the wind. And it's mostly these male hemp plants that, and in some cases, monoecious plants that also have male flowers that are producing all of this pollen. Hemp plants, whether male or female, do not produce nectar. So when I say you cannot get hemp honey, what I mean by that is that the nectar that is used by bees to produce that honey would not be coming from hemp plants. That's really important to think about as well in terms of the resources that hemp might provide for bees, because it's certainly not going to be providing that nectar resource. So you want to make sure that if you're in a high hemp landscape, you also have really good sources of nectar around. So again, some of these slides come from talks I give to hemp growers, not to beekeepers. So I'm sure you all know that female bees are out there gathering pollen, not just out of the generosity of their hearts, but they're doing that in order to feed the developing larvae within the colony. So they're not out there actually pollinating hemp, primarily for the reason that they spend almost all of their foraging efforts on the male plants, and they really do not interact with female flowers at all. So I don't think that honeybees are likely to be providing a pollination service for hemp, potentially only in the rare instances when you have monoecious cultivars that would have both male and female flowers on the same hemp plant. So in the pollen, in the male flowers, and this is a close-up image of a single male flower, we do find that there are small amounts of CBD and THC that are present in pollen, although generally only in very small quantities and only those acidic forms, so forms that are non-psychoactive. Interestingly, I got a lot of questions from the public as well as from beekeepers about why bees might be going to hemp. Is there any potential for there to be effects on bees' perception or their ability to forage? Maybe the bees are out there getting a buzz from visiting these hemp plants. But we actually know that insects and arthropods broadly lack the endocannabinoid receptors that we would have in our bodies that are what the CBD or THC molecules are binding to. And they also, again, are produced in the plant in their acidic form, which, at least for humans, is non-psychoactive. But what's really key, what we found in our research, is that the period of the year when these male hemp plants are flowering is when there are very few other floral resources available. So that could be a critical window for supplying a pollen resource in that midsummer gap period when there's not very many other flowers around. Some research that was done with a student of mine, Nate Flicker, who's pictured here. We surveyed many different hemp farms throughout New York State in the 2018 field season. If you're not super familiar with hemp or cannabis, there's many different market classes for these products. So I would say it's not dissimilar to a plant like brassica, where you have one species that has many different uses and very different phenotypes of the plant. So you might have broccoli, which has been selected for its inflorescence. You also have kohlrabi, which is selected for its stem, or kale, which is selected more for its leaf production. We have the same kind of diversity within the species Cannabis sativa. So we have some cultivars that are selected for grain production and selected for their seeds, some that are selected for fiber production. So they're very tall and are grown mainly for that stem tissue that produces textile grade fibers. And then, of course, there is production for high cannabinoid producing varieties, either for the recreational market or for the CBD market. And what we were finding is, because in the high cannabinoid side of the market segment, so plants that are selected for their female inflorescences, you do not want any pollination to occur in those plants. So you tend to produce only the female plants in your field. So there really are very few male plants in those systems. Ideally, from a grower's perspective, there are no male plants in the field. That's not always the case, but that is certainly the goal for high cannabinoid production. It's really just the production systems where we're growing for grain or where we're growing for fiber that we see bees abundantly in those hemp fields. So what we found in New York State from some of the surveys that Nate led is that honeybees are certainly the dominant member of that hemp visitor community. So Nate went out and sampled 12 different industrial hemp sites, so those that were producing grain and fiber exclusively and not producing the high cannabinoid hemp. He did several rounds of netting bees off of the flowers of those industrial hemp plants, and then we brought them back to the lab to look at variation in abundance and diversity across the farms. So we can say pretty confidently that these were bees that were actually out there collecting the pollen of these industrial hemp plants. So mostly honeybees, but we are also seeing a suite of different native wild bee species, including the common eastern bumblebee, as well as a few different species in the family Halictidae, which are commonly referred to as sweat bees. Some beautiful green metallic sweat bees in there, as well as the tiny little ones that on first glance you might not even think are actually bees. But good diversity represented from across all of our sites. We were really surprised to see a study that came out right around the same time as ours, showing in Colorado, surveying just a single site and reporting a much, much larger diversity of bees visiting their site. But it turned out actually that they were using some trapping methods for the bees, so not actually collecting them on the hemp plants themselves, which might explain why they got a broader diversity. For example, the third most abundant species in their pollinator community is Pepinapis, which is a specialist on squash. I would be very, very surprised to see that bee visiting anything except for squash. So I do think in the West, it's very possible that there could be a broader diversity of different bees that are using hemp plants. But I'm it's not clear of this set which of the ones are actually visiting. There's generally an overall greater diversity of bees in more arid regions and out west than we have in the Northeast here. So I'm really excited to see more research come out in different areas that might identify other species that are also benefiting from visiting hemp plants. What we also know from other work, I mentioned before, I've been working for many years before I started looking at hemp in pollinator communities on small fruit and vegetable farms in the Northeast. So I had a pretty good idea of what the pollinator communities for those crops look like. And what we were able to document is that the communities that are visiting hemp share the same species that are really important for many other crops within our region. And even, in the case of tomato, we see 60% overlap in the pollinator species that are visiting tomato compared to visiting hemp within our region. So we're able to use these network level analyses that compare hemp, and we find that it's kind of this hub crop that sits in the middle where all of these other points here represent other crops that are grown within our region. And the blue circles are different important pollinator species that are providing pollination services for many different crops. So it might be that as we start to expand the production, particularly of these grain and fiber hemp cultivars, that we will see a benefit to other crops that are growing nearby. I want to check the chat really quick, just to make sure that I'm not missing anything essential.
I have all your questions queued up.
Oh, lovely. Should I wait till the end then?
Yeah, you can go through and I'll send out the questions. I'll read them out to you so that you can answer them.
Perfect. It seems like we have a few, so I'll try to be quick in here so that we have time to have some good discussion. Then I think that'll be nice. So some other things that we saw were that there was a variation in the number of wild bees that we found on farms depending on the level of agricultural cover surrounding a farm. That's a pattern that we have seen in many other crops within our region, is that as we expand agricultural cover and we lose natural habitats that are critical for supporting wild pollinator populations, that we see a reduction in their abundance within the farm. We were sort of hoping that it might be the case that having hemp around might mean that populations would be fine. But of course, it's really important to think about the resources that hemp is not providing. So it's certainly not providing nectar resources, which are also critical for wild bees, as well as habitat. So it can potentially serve as a good resource in terms of its flora, the pollen that it's producing, but you want to make sure that there is complementarity of other resources within the landscape. Some other farm scale factors that we found were very important was the weediness of the field. So 2018, at least in the Northeast, was still pretty early in the adoption of hemp on farms. In fact, it's still quite early even now in our understanding of the best practices for producing hemp and incorporating it into our crop rotations here in the Northeast. So we did see that farms where they were able to get really good establishment of their fields and had low levels of weeds, we saw a lot more bees visiting the hemp flowers. But probably that's just because they weren't distracted by all of the weeds that were in the field. Sorry, guys, for the dogs. We also saw that tall plants were the ones that seemed to be most attractive to the wild bees. So hold on 1 second. I'm so sorry. apologies, guys. I have a puppy. Doesn't want to behave. Let me just go back a slide real quick here and just finish that thought on the height. So we mostly are seeing the really tall cultivars those are the ones that we're growing for fiber. Those seem to be most attractive to the bees compared to shorter varieties that are mostly grown for grain production within the region. So lots of factors to think about. I saw in the chat a couple questions about pollen and the nutritional value there. That is definitely a huge question that I have going forward. Is there a mechanism for doing questions? I don't know how your group normally handles those.
Unmuted. Okay, yes. I have all of them queued up, so I can just start calling out the questions if you wanna just listen and then answer the questions as we go along, if that works for you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Perfect. So the first question is, what is the nutritional value of hemp pollen for the honeybees? It's been discussed that honeybees are not particularly attracted to hemp unless there's a lack of other pollen resources. Is this true? Or do bees tend to visit hemp equally as other pollen sources available?
So we actually don't know too much about the nutritional value of hemp for honeybees. Most of the studies that have looked at the composition of hemp pollens have been focused on proteins and have mostly been a sort of a focus within the allergy world. So in the Midwest, we know that, from a study that was done, I want to say in the late 90s, showed that hemp pollen can be as much as 35% of the overall aerial pollen within that region during the summer months. That was well before legalization within the US. We did have some level of Canadian production of hemp and, of course, feral hemp populations everywhere. So many folks are concerned about the potential for hemp pollen, because it is windborne and aerially distributed, to be an allergen. So there's been a little bit of work on specific proteins within hemp pollens, but not so much overall on characterizing the protein or lipid or carbohydrate composition as it might relate to a pollinator diet source. I did a little bit of literature searching, and I found, I think there's a wonderful review by James Kane, who showed that, he at least found one study that had looked at hemp pollen or tried to estimate its protein composition. And he had an estimate of about 30%, which I would say is, on average, it's a good estimate for a wind pollinated plant. But I've also seen estimates as low as 3% protein composition. So I think that's something that is certainly not clear yet from the literature. And nutritional composition may actually be part of what's mediating that attraction of bees towards the hemp pollen. So I was really, really surprised to see the abundance of bees that we are finding. I mean, in some of the fields that we go out to, they are literally buzzing with bees when we go out there. And that's, when they're sitting next to fields of buckwheat or clover or other crops that I would think would have very good forage resources for bees. In my experience, which is, at this point is still anecdotal in terms of the comparison of preference for bees to different crops, it does seem like they really like the hemp pollen. So again, there may be huge differences in cultivars in what their pollen nutritional composition might look like. Or it could also be some of these secondary metabolites that we find in hemp, like terpenes and like cannabinoids, that could actually be driving the attraction of pollinators to those pollen sources, even if they are not the optimal nutritional profile for a bee. So it may be that, they host some of these compounds that can mediate interactions with microbes that are important for them. Hopefully there was many parts to that question. So hopefully I touched on all of them.
Yes, I believe you did. And you actually answered a few of the other questions that were in chat as well. Our next question is, what is the most common species of pollinator visiting hemp versus the other sources you mentioned?
So tomato is one that shares quite a lot of its pollinator community with hemp. However, it does not share honeybees in common. And I'm sure as beekeepers, you are not at all surprised about that, because in addition to tomato being similar to hemp in that it does not provide nectar, it also requires buzz pollination. So it's similar to hemp in that we see most of the other bees that can do that buzz pollination mechanism. So honeybees, as well as many of those small sweat bees, are visiting tomato and also visiting hemp. It could also be at that they're present around and flowering around the same time. That is what's the major limiting factor in sharing the pollinator visitor community between hemp and other crops like apples, strawberries, or cranberry, for example, because they're blooming much earlier in the year and are visited predominantly by bees that are only active during that spring season. So the pollinators of those early flowering crops like apple and strawberry just aren't around when hemp is flowering. That's just part of their, life history, that they are only around for a few weeks, which is, good for them in the sense that they need fewer resources. It's a little bit less risky in the long term, as long as they're out at a time when there are good resources. So hopefully that common species visiting hemp versus the other sources, hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And we have one last question queued up. So if anybody else is interested in asking Heather questions this evening, please get those into the chat. But our last question we have queued is, I hear that bees are making propolis from hemp resin. Is this true?
I have definitely heard reports that there, honeybees that are kept in areas that have very high cover of industrial hemp will end up with propolis that has cannabinoids in that, in that hive product. However, I don't know that they're going out and taking the resin type extract that's coming out of those trichomes. They're actively collecting it and bringing that back to the hive to use as a propolis compound. So I'm not sure that anybody has that I've seen. I would be happy to know if there are observations of that out there, but I have not seen that.
Great, thank you so much. So if there are any last questions, this is the last call for questions for Dr. Heather Grab. Going once, going twice, get them up in the chat, please.
I'm happy to hang on. I'm very interested to learn about the cannabis infused honey. So if a question does occur later on, I'll be around.
Awesome, thank
Great,
you.
thank you.
I'm talking from a hallway, but yeah, I wanted to first introduce Donna, who's going to talk about CBD infused honey. I do say make sure you're following the local laws and regulations when it comes to CBD and cannabis infused honey, because Virginia went ahead and legalized marijuana, but they haven't really regulated it as a product for consumption yet. So I just wanted to make everybody aware of that. I also wanted to thank Heather as the treasurer. We're going to go ahead and send a $200 check to the Cornell Hemp Project so they can continue their research. And we really appreciate her coming out and doing this with us.
Thanks. We'll try to answer that question about protein composition with that money.
Thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and keep up the good work. We're learning, everybody's learning, and that's important. Okay, so I guess we'll move it over to Donna, and thank you, Heather, and thank you, Donna.
I'm not a Zoom expert, so I just want to make sure that I'm unmuted and working. So cannabis edibles for fun and friends. I don't sell anything. I don't earn any money from them. I just basically I basically do it for fun. Massachusetts allows home grow, so I do grow my own cannabis. I do buy CBD from a company called Sacred Smoke out of Oregon, and they do high quality CBD. So if CBD is something that you're interested in trying, definitely order from them. There are plenty of resources for CBD on the internet that you can get good quality items. So basically, infusing products is pretty easy. Honey is not the greatest vehicle for infusing cannabis. So a lot of people, when they infuse cannabis, they do mix it with a coconut oil or butter or ghee, because you need that fat to bring the cannabinoids over into your system. If you want to get high, or if you want to relax, or pain relief, etc. Basically, the recipe is a cup, it's scalable, obviously, but I basically do 1 cup of honey, and then about a teaspoon of lecithin, because that helps to with the infusion, and then 3 to 8 grams of CBD or cannabis, depending on what you want to use. And then there are several methods that you can do. You can grind your cannabis flower, or you can purchase keef, CBD keef, or they call it hash, which you can infuse directly. Just mix it into your raw honey and then just leave it there and let it infuse. And then when you put it in tea or baked goods, it's just right there, and that just kind of, it's probably the easiest way, and especially beekeepers don't want to heat the honey to ruin the beneficials that are in your raw local honey. Excuse me. A lot of recipes you'll find on the internet are crock pot method. I did do a little bit of testing to see. I did take about a cup of honey. I took 5 grams of CBD. I put a probe thermometer into the crock pot with the honey mixture, and the crock pot did max out at 186 degrees on low while it was doing the infusion. And I know that's beyond the point of degradation for honey, so it's not necessarily the best method to use. So it takes about 12 to 24 hours to infuse through the crock pot method. You can do it on within 4 to 6 on high, but the lower temperatures are probably better if you wanted to go that route. The other method is using infused coconut oil, which is basically you would infuse it the same way you would infuse honey. You would take a cup of coconut oil, you would take your flour or your hash, mix it in, infuse it into the coconut oil through the generally with the crock pot method, which is the easiest way to do it. And that takes about 12, it can go forever, but it can take about 6 to 12 hours to infuse some coconut oil. What you want to do first, though, I should have mentioned, when you have your CBD flower, you do want to decarboxylate it, which is activating the CBD or the THC in the flower, because otherwise you're not going to get the end result that you want from a non-decarboxylated product. You don't want to get your house all stinky. You want to put your flour into a mason jar. You weigh it out first, obviously, depending on how much you want to use. I usually use about 5 grams because it's a good solid amount into a cup of honey. It's about 10 grams once it's all infused. So your oven goes to 225 degrees. put the mason jar into your oven. You let it go for about 45 minutes to an hour. You want the CBD to be nice and toasty brown. You don't want it to get too dark because you don't want to degrade the product too far beyond. And then once it's decarboxylated, you put it into some melted coconut oil. You put you put your little mason jar. I use a 16-ounce jar in my crock pot. You cover it with about a cup of melted coconut oil. You put that in, you fill the crock pot to the top of the band on the mason jar, and then you just set it for low and you let it go for 6 to 12 hours. Once you're done, you strain it, you save the CBD flower, because you can just wrap it up in some cheesecloth, put that into your freezer, and then the next time you want to use it, you can dunk it in your cup of tea, you can mix it with your honey, you can do pretty much anything with it. It's just like just so you don't waste it. So then once you have your infused coconut oil, you just take about a quarter cup of that infused coconut oil, mix it in with a cup of honey. I put it in a food processor or mini chopper to whip it, and it kind of comes up. I don't know if you can see this. This is what it looks like when it's been infused. It's still the same nice raw honey. It's not been heated. It has the coconut oil, which is that fat that you need to make the THC or CBD activated in your system. That's about all I have. It's not too difficult. If anybody has questions, I am happy to answer them.
I saw them at the hemp stores, and I saw them at the gas station the other day, able to sell those CBD infused honey sticks.
Quite honestly, I that's beyond my scope. I don't know. I don't know. I don't sell it, so they do. We go to a dispensary to get our products, but how they do, I know it has to be. I believe it has to be hemp derived. It cannot be cannabis derived CBD.
Okay.
For products that are sold in retail stores now, but beyond that, I don't really know what the regulations are federally.
I can just add as a follow-up to that, that, like Donna is right. It's very unclear. Those rules, the entire industry is really waiting on the FDA to make some rulings, and they continue to delay and not be very clear about how they're going to regulate those products. In the meantime, many states, for example, New York State, where I live, we have developed a very robust regulatory framework in order to incentivize production of, food and beverage products that contain cannabinoids, even though federally that is not legal. Like everyone's in a gray area, but I think in particular for beekeepers, for all the other products that are out there, people that are making their CBD infused green tea products, they can just stop adding CBD. For beekeepers, because they may not have control over what their bees are bringing back to the hive, you might still have cannabinoids in your honey, in your wax, or in your propolis. And it's just something to be aware of.
Thank you.
Oh, I have pollen traps on some of my hives, and I purposely collect pollen and sell it as raw bee pollen. If my bees were exposed to a large amount of hemp, then that could be an issue based on what you're saying legally.
Yeah, and I would say that's probably the highest risk of all of the hive products. So Donna mentioned that cannabinoids are very lipophilic. They do not necessarily like to go into those, more aqueous types of medium. So wax would definitely be one product that I would be concerned about. But of course, also the pollen itself coming in, we have seen as much as 3% cannabinoid composition by weight in pollens. The regulatory threshold within New York State and also federally at the moment is 0.3% for THC. So for CBD, you can really have any amount you want. even though federally the government says it's illegal to put that in any food product. If you sell your pollen as a supplement, that has a little bit more leeway, but even then the FDA, of course, does not allow pharmaceutical products in, supplements either. But they've seemed to be given broadly a little bit more leeway with those types of products. I've seen like many fewer instances where folks are getting cease and desist orders unless they're trying to make some kind of health claim there. But yeah, I would say the pollen itself and the wax are two of the highest risk sources.
So if I'm not putting it in a food product, it is coming to me naturally as a natural product, just like honey. Wherever they have a honey standard, you can't add to or take away from anything that's naturally occurring and still call it honey. But would that not be as big a concern, since I'm not actually being actively putting it in there? It's coming to me from nature.
I would love to think that regulators might be amenable to that kind of a philosophy, but I am not at all optimistic that they will. So I think regulators have just sort of applied this uniform standard across all products, whether that is things that we are consuming, things that we are vaporizing, things that we are putting on our bodies, and how they regulate hemp, being incredibly conservative in the way that they apply those regulations. So I wouldn't hold out hope. I think it's overall low risk. I don't think folks are going to, go out there and start testing honeys. And, I don't think the Department of Ag and Markets, or however that functions for folks in Virginia, is going to go out there and start trying to regulate those things. But it is a potential thing that we should be thinking about.
Consistent with what you said already about other areas, I can tell you that in Virginia, it was a fairly rapid process bringing this to legalization. But then, like you said, the details have not been ironed out, and there's still a lot of work to be done on that. So I think right now you might be able to play on the gray area that is very prevalent when it comes to this, but you might also be the ones that they test their laws on. So be careful.
Yeah. And I would say in New York State, as I've watched the industry evolve here recently, I've been very impressed with how responsive our politicians are in crafting that broader policy in response to the concerns of their constituents, and particularly key agricultural stakeholder groups. So I think there is potential if you do see the legislation that looks like it could be concerning, that you can certainly approach, the folks who are crafting that legislative text and help them to see why there may be some of these unforeseen consequences for other industries. So I think, that's definitely a very important step. I hope that the legislature in Virginia is also as amenable to the folks in New York have, mostly been, more or less. And then I will also say, just everyone has very little experience in working with the plant and working with the policies. So I think from, every state has different regulators that have been tasked by the USDA essentially with managing these programs, and with very little education and with very few additional resources in order to build out these huge regulatory bodies. So I think everybody is learning, which is good, and hopefully people are approaching this with everyone's best interest in mind.
Okay, well then, if no one else has any other questions, that we are right at about an hour, and this has been very informative, and hopefully it has sparked some conversation and some proactive thinking from the beekeepers and that was our objective. So we really appreciate both of you and what you've contributed to today. And from a research standpoint, if maybe if you have a website that will take other donations, then you could post that, and then the individual members can contribute if they choose to do so from a personal standpoint. But other than that, I think we can go ahead and end this meeting. And again, thank you very much for your participation for both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Have a great
Good
evening.
night.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can send Donna some